I'll have to say initially that some level of inequality in any society is both unavoidable and to some degree desirable. If people can actually either use that inequality to invest and innovate, or do things which like on a grand social scale that are worth playing out. I've answered that badly. I'll start again. Some level of inequality is both unavoidable and to some degree desirable, because it gives in a capitalist society in particular, it gives a motivation for people to innovate in the expectation of enormous gain, which wouldn't otherwise happen if you could somehow suppress inequality. But what we've had in capitalism is an enormous growth in inequality for totally unproductive reasons. And what's caused the increase in inequality is fundamentally the increase in finance. Because as I've built mathematical models that had this as an outcome, it's not something I programmed into the models, it's what's called an emergent phenomenon. But if I had a model, a very, very simple mathematical model, where workers demanded wage rises depending upon the level of employment, which is a standard economic assumption, where firms invested based on the rate of profit, and where banks charge money on debt, all of which are realistic assumptions, then if there was a runaway level of private debt, so private debt did not stabilise, what happened was, even though the firms were borrowing the money, so capitalists were effectively going into debt, the group that paid for it over time were workers. Workers' wage demands dropped, the share going to bankers rose, capitalists sat in the middle. So rising inequality actually came out of a rising amount of money going to the finance sector, because the increasing level of debt gave the financial sector a bigger and bigger claim on the productive resources of the society. So my first essential thing in getting to a less unequal and a more creative society is to reduce the level of private debt. Because if in that particular dynamic, if it keeps on going, the system crashes. So it isn't just that inequality is a bad thing. Inequality leads to crises like the financial crisis in 2008, and it's all driven by letting private debt get out of control. So that's my perspective. So therefore, if private debt getting out of control is the cause, then the only real solution is to reduce the level of private debt. Now, if we look historically at how that's been done, everybody fantasises that you can reduce the level of private debt by growing faster. So you just somehow manage to increase the rate of growth of the economy. Empirically, that has never happened, in the sole exception being countries like Saudi Arabia, where an enormous increase in their export revenues, courtesy of a huge increase in the price of their exports, meant that they could pay the debt down dramatically using that export surplus. Every other country in the last 1.5 centuries that has had a debt crisis has only got out of the debt by writing the debt off. That includes Germany. Germany got out of the Weimar Republic collapse by writing off the debt under the Nazis. And then after the Second World War, they had a potential booming economy even after their economy was devastated, because Western countries, including Greece, forgave Germany's debt. And therefore it started with a very low level of private debt, also low level of government debt. But the low level of private debt meant that firms could borrow money to invest without the increase in the debt causing an enormous impact upon profitability. So you had a huge boom coming out of that. Now, the trouble is, when you get to the level of private debt we have these days, creditors have enormous political power. The politicians are always talking to bankers. They're never talking to debtors. And so the political system gets twisted in their favour. So you only ever make the decision to pay the debt down when you have something like a popular uprising. Now, that's what happened in Iceland this time round. And Iceland is the only country to come out of the crisis, not perfectly, and it's recreating some of its problems again right now, but it got out of the crisis by writing the debt off. And everybody said, you can't do that, nobody will trade with you, you won't be trusted anymore, etc., etc. Iceland wrote that debt off, and the debt was 10 times their GDP. That's the level of debt the private banks accumulated. So it does work, but the political opposition is normally so enormous it doesn't happen.
Well, people say that it's not an example because Iceland is a very small country. Right?
The people of Iceland literally surrounded the parliament, because they were going to pay that debt back. They were going to sign up to 20 or 30 years of austerity to try to pay the debt back to the foreign borrowers. And the people of Iceland, I think this population is only 300,000 people, but something like about 50,000 or more of them surrounded the Parliament House where the President was about to sign that bill. And he basically looked out the window and said, I'm not signing that bill. And therefore the alternative was to write the debt off and to put the bankers in jail, which is what they did. And so in that particular country, debtor power could be focused because the debtors could surround the Parliament. That doesn't happen in America, it doesn't happen in the UK, it doesn't happen in Spain. So creditor power dominates, and therefore we get caught in an impasse. And finally, unfortunately, most of the time we get out of this, it's by some political upheaval. And things like your Catalonia experience right now are part of that. Piketty's data is fantastic, and I really appreciate the extent to which he's focused upon inequality over time, and to make it obviously undeniable that we're in one of the most unequal periods in human society, so that's very important. His explanation, the R greater than G explanation, the rate of interest higher than the rate of growth, is too simplistic. And what I've done is try to build a more solidly grounded explanation of where that inequality comes from. And what turns up as my explanation ends up being private debt growth has caused the inequality, and private debt growth has also caused the increase in asset prices, which of course increases the relative wealth disparity, because the wealthy who own the assets, the leverage we take out has actually driven up asset prices. So basically he has a sort of half neoclassical explanation for where the inequalities come from. I've got a strongly complex systems explanation. So same rough conclusions. I don't believe taxation alone will solve it. I don't believe we're ever going to get, as Piketty recommends, to a system of international taxation to stop this sort of thing happening. My solutions come down to using government money creation capability to attenuate the growth in inequality, because it's very easy to evade tax, and we've seen that happen all the time with the wealthy. The poor can't evade the tax, the wealthy can. So all attempts to change these systems using taxation revenue solutions, I think, fail, both politically and practically. But you can't evade government spending. So if the government uses its capacity to create money, rather than taking money away from people in taxation at the top end, you give money to people directly at the poor end. The rich can't stop you doing that. And that increasing the amount of money the poor have by creating it for them through government money creation capability, using it to cancel private debt at the same time, those are things which you can't stop. So it'd be technically feasible to do it, and we've already seen governments in the West doing enormous quantitative easing, which is money creation with a particular purpose. That money creation has created, in the UK's case, in 1 year, they created an amount of money equivalent to about 1/7 of the UK GDP. Now, nobody paid a QE tax to pay for that. So the money creation capability is easy to do, technically. The difficult thing is politically convincing the authorities that they should do that. And because they're so caught up in believing that the creditors should dominate, that's the main block to it actually happening. Yeah, again, I wanted to make this comment in the session we've just come from, because one of the questioners said, how are you going to pay for the basic income? There's one element for basic income: you must have the productive capacity for it. So you simply can't say we're going to give everybody a basic income that means every Brazilian can afford to buy a new Tesla every year. You simply don't have the productive capability. So the level at which you can do this depends upon your physical productive capability in your economy, which you would hope to build up over time. But the government anywhere in the world, any government that has its own currency, can create its own currency without limit. And that's again why I use the example of QE, because QE in Britain's case, they were creating £200 billion of QE per year, which is about 1/6, 1/7 of the economy. In America's case, they were creating QE for the financial sector at the rate of $1 trillion per year. That's roughly 7% of the American economy every year that they've done that for. So it's being done. It's not impossible at all. What that has actually done, of course, is radically increased asset prices. It's increased the inequality we got from the debt bubble in the first place. But there's no technical reason why they can't do it. So if you do it, you must be doing it relative to your productive capacity, and relative to how much of that money you create will go into imports, because if too much of the money goes into imports and you have a floating exchange rate, your exchange rate will plunge. You'll end up having a devaluation that will cause domestic inflation to some degree. That will undermine the political viability of what you're doing. So it's not a simple solution at all. You have to see how it interacts with other factors. But technically speaking, any government that creates its own money, and that includes every country in the world except the members of the European Union, Eurozone, any country that creates its own money can do it. No, I think we're so far into brown economy, it's actually almost a black economy. We haven't realised it yet. We are doing so much damage to the ecology of the planet, and mainstream economists, have been a major factor why we haven't understood that, because they've never understood the role of energy in production in the very first place. So they've never realised that there are energy waste constraints on how much we can produce on a finite planet. They think the limits to growth means we're going to run out of resources. No, we can also put so much strain on the ecology that the ecological system will collapse on us. And if you look at one of the best measures that's been done of the extent to which we're overstressing the planet right now is called the human ecological footprint. If you check that out, you'll see that I think in the UK's case, I think if you imagine the Earth has a certain capability to reproduce itself every year, then what the human ecological footprint said is, okay, what demands are humans putting on the land area of each country, and how does that relate to that particular land area's capability to reproduce its own productive capacity per annum? I think in the UK's case, they're running at about a factor of 5. So in effect, the UK is using 5 times its own reproductive capability every year to continue doing what it's doing now. America's 3 or 4, even with the enormous landmass that it has. Most countries in the world are exceeding their ecological capability. If economists understood the essential role of energy in production and realised that when you use energy you necessarily create waste as well, then they may have been aware of this limit of the biosphere to cope with what we're taking out of it in terms of our production system. They're not. We've gone far past the point of no return, and it's only a question of how does the planet tell us we've gone past that point of no return that matters. We're going to find something in the next 20 to 50 years which will be absolutely devastating, and we'll realise we simply have to restrain ourselves, and that is probably going to be the most severe challenge humanity has ever faced. The group of non-orthodox economists have been trying for probably 50 years to sensibly incorporate energy's role in production. First person being a Romanian economist called Georgescu Rojan, and he realised that the universe is ruled by what's called the laws of thermodynamics. If you have a closed system, then that closed system degrades over time, and you can only have production and life if there's an open system taking in energy from the outside. But when you take advantage of that energy, you necessarily generate waste. And these were the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. He then said economics theory is not consistent with that. So how do we do that? Well, if you look at conventional economic theory, it has what's called a Cobb-Douglas production function, or what they call CES production functions as well. And that basically argues output is a function of how much labour you have, multiplied by how much capital you have, with a couple of mathematical terms in there as well. And that presumes you can produce output just with labour and capital. Now you can't. Okay, you've got to use energy as well. So what Georgescu Rojan said was, let's add energy as the third factor. You need another little couple of parameters there, but you have output as a factor of how much labour raised to a power, multiplied by how much capital raised to another power, multiplied by how much energy raised to another power. I never liked that expression. It was better than not acknowledging energy, but it implied, if you set the powers correctly, it implied you could still have output with no energy. So what I realised, this is just last year, is that the whole idea of labour and capital without energy is nonsense. The little phrase that first came into my mind that brought it home to me was, labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. Neither people nor machines can do anything unless they're processing energy. So what labour and capital both are effectively mechanisms to harness the free energy we find in the universe to do something useful. Now once you've got that concluded, then your production function actually boils down to, in a modern capitalist society, really the amount of energy your machines process, because labour's direct caloric energy input to production is pretty limited. Somebody might slice bread, but they're using a knife to slice the bread. Okay, you might get a massage. Well, that's about the only direct form of energy input that a machine is not involved in, but you can get machines that massage you now at airports. Okay? So everything is about harnessing the energy. Labour's role these days really is to use its energy processing capability to control the machines. The machines by far are the source of all the energy we direct into useful work that we have these days. So once you have that understanding there, then because to use energy you must also generate waste, then there's a necessary link between the ecology and the economy. And that's the major work that I've done in the last year, and what I'm now trying to do is to elaborate that and build a combined ecological economic model.